Rubens, one of the 2 or 3 greatest painters of the 17th century, an age in which men like Rembrandt and Velázquez and Vermeer were also at work. Yet in the United States, outside the galleries and museums and art schools, Rubens may be best known as the artist who paints those voluptuous pink nudes with the dimpled thighs and the bovine eyes, the sort of paintings that used to hang above bars in the 1920s. This one, for example, The Rape of Europa. Except it's not a Rubens. The artist is Francois Marot, and the canvas was completed around 1710, a full 70 years after Rubens had died. This one then, Venus Rising from the Waves. It bears Rubens' stamp, certainly, but it happens to have been done by Francois Boucher around 1765. Then surely this one, Women Bathing. Wrong again. It wasn't Rubens who painted it, but the volatile Frenchman Jean-Honoré Fragonard in the late 18th century. But there can't be any mistaking this one, or can there? Its title is Odalisque. Its date, the early 19th century, and it was painted by Eugene Delacroix. In fact, Alexandre Dumas once described the gifted Delacroix as this second Rubens.
CBS News presents Lamp Unto My Feet. Today, After Rubens, a look at a student exhibition of Rubenism in Providence, Rhode Island. The narrator is Barbara Lee Diamonstein.
We don't know Rubens very well in this country, but for 3 centuries the painters of Europe knew him very well indeed, and unabashedly copied him. He was the unchallenged master of 17th century Baroque painting, the laureate of court and church. Those who followed felt that they had to come to terms with him, to master the many conventions that he had established. Not just Boucher and Fragonard and Delacroix, but also Watteau, Gainsborough, Reynolds, and Géricault. Surprisingly, an attempt has never been made to mount an exhibit tracing Rubens' impact on 3 centuries of painters. Never, that is, until 8 graduate students from Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island decided to give it a try. On a modest budget, with few connections and no professional experience in the clubby world of curators and collectors, they managed to assemble a highly intelligent and valuable exhibition. How were they able to accomplish this, and why did they try in the first place? The show was part of their graduate training. The students, 6 women and 2 men, none older than 28, worked under Mary Crawford Volk, a young Yale-trained professor of art at Brown. Molly Volk suggested the theme, that her students weigh the question of artists' influence, and the much emulated Peter Paul Rubens seemed the best and most obvious candidate. Part of the problem, as in any exhibit, was to gather enough significant work to support the thesis. Molly and her students sounded out museums and private collectors. They wound up with quite an impressive selection. 88 paintings, drawings, and engravings by the master, and a dozen of his most celebrated disciples. The works came from near and far.
Invite scholars.
Did you hear much in the comments on the late 17th century section? Because most people hadn't seen very many things, and
I heard some, Karen, most of them favorable, but I think admiringly favorable, because they realized what a difficult terrain it was to work in, and you were starting from less advantageous scholarship than, say, a number of the other cases were. And particularly people were astounded at some of the things you were able to get and pull together, and particularly interested in, say, the Coipel and the Juvenet as against the Rubens drawing of Christ. A number of people called attention to that area, which was kind of pleasant. And there were one or two questions about attributions, but the thing is, your opinion is as good as anyone else's. There was a Fragonard expert here you may have known, I don't know whether you met her, who went around and went over all your drawings with a kind of magnifying glass. Now, why does she date it 1774, instead of 1769? I said, well, have you seen the catalog entry after all? She worked quite hard on that one. And she looked it up and so forth, and darn it, she didn't back down.
She did.
Well, as a matter of fact, very good reasoning, and I meant to tell you earlier, because she was quite emphatic when she first started. No, I think it's 1769, not 74. I said, well, I don't think so. I remember going round and round on this one. And so she read very carefully and came back very sheepishly and said, well, good case made for that 1774 date. I said, I'll tell Simone.
Well,
So
thank you. I'm very
pleased.
gratified over that, because a lot of Fragonard scholarship is quite bad, and the major scholar dates things in lumps, and nobody bothers to check them. And it's it didn't take any great brilliant scholarship to put these two facts together.
No.
It was undocumented.
But it was nonetheless something that hadn't been done before.
Every year since 1968, the Rhode Island School of Design, sometimes called RISD, and Brown University's Department of Art have cooperated in assembling other scholarly and well-mounted, if less ambitious, efforts. The graduate students had the assistance of the RISD Museum of Art curatorial staff and its director, Stephen Ostro.
Well, the Museum of Art is one of the major museums in New England with an enormous collection, and it's right across the street from Brown University, and over these 8 years or so, we've developed numerous relationships with Brown. Members of our staff teach there. Their students tend to use this as a basic laboratory, and along with these other areas of collaboration, we've worked with them putting on an exhibition each year. The Rubenism show is the 8th in this series. They tend to supply the academic expertise in this particular program, and we supply all of the logistic support, a certain amount of expertise on how one goes about getting loans, shipping, transportation, insurance, registration, inspection, and finally, over the years, we've lent many works of art to other institutions, and the payback, the return in kind, has a great deal to do with the quality of the exhibition. It allows them to borrow works which they otherwise might not be able to get.
The exhibit was housed here in the Bell Gallery of the List Art Building of Brown University, atop one of the 3 hills that dominate the city of Providence. In a way, Providence is a highly appropriate spot for such an exhibit. Rubens was a great humanist. He was a devout Catholic, one who was educated at the Jesuit College in Antwerp and who attended Mass almost every morning of his life. Still, in an age when the Church of Rome and the emerging Protestant sects were not exactly on the best of terms, Rubens moved easily in all communities. This was the sort of spirit that would have appealed to the man who founded Providence, Roger Williams. Williams had been banished from Massachusetts for challenging the Puritan theocracy that was running the colony with an iron hand. In 1636, just 4 years before Rubens died, Roger Williams found a new home at the head of Narragansett Bay. He saw Providence as a shelter for persons distressed for conscience, and the new colony was open to all, Quakers, Baptists, Jews. A little way down from the site of the Rubens exhibit stands the splendid New England church, the First Baptist Meeting House it's called, and it's celebrating its 200th anniversary this year. As for Providence, it was founded on piety, but soon enjoyed considerable material prosperity, at least for a while. Today, the city of 200,000 makes tools and jewelry, textiles and hardware, and lives in the long shadows cast by Boston and New York most of the time. Of course, no Rubens show can do the master full justice, probably not even New York's Metropolitan or Boston's Museum of Fine Arts. There's just too vast and far-flung a body of work. Rubens is known to have produced something like 1,000 oils and 1,500 drawings. He worked swiftly, but not carelessly. He was a master at drawing and composition, and an unmatched colorist as well. Rubens once said, "My talent is of such a kind that no commission, however great in size or varied in subject matter, ever daunted me." That sounds insufferably arrogant. However, it also happens to be true. And yet, if Rubens had never put brush to canvas, he would still be considered a rare person. He was a polished diplomat who was constantly being sent off to handle delicate negotiations in France, England, Spain, and Italy. He was a discriminating collector of antique sculpture and gems, a devoted husband and family man, a scholar. He wrote as well. 2 volumes of his journals have been published. No wonder he has been described as a perfectly luminous human being who inspired confidence and understanding by his very appearance. This Rubens exhibit was organized thematically: landscapes, religious works, portraits, history and allegory, battles and hunts. Rubens was expert at all of them. He had absorbed and transmuted almost the entire range of classical and humanist art. A native of Flanders, he spent 8 years at the court of his patron, the Duke of Mantua. This Italian period enabled him to fuse the heritage of Northern European painting with that of the Mediterranean, just as it was moving into a new post-Renaissance period. The result? Let's see for ourselves. The 2 woodcuts before us are variations on one of Rubens' greatest masterpieces, The Garden of Love. The oil painting itself hangs in the Prado in Madrid. Still, these detail studies give us an idea of the scope of the whole work. Here is Rubens' conception of the earthly paradise, a lush garden of Venus, peopled by robust, Flemish-looking women and muscular courtiers. In a moment, we'll talk about how Rubens influenced those who followed him. But first, we ought to consider the question, who influenced Rubens? The impact of Titian is plainly visible here, although in much of his work, Rubens also drew inspiration from Tintoretto and Veronese, Leonardo and Michelangelo. If a large number of painters influenced Rubens, Rubens himself was to influence an even larger number. He was gifted enough to nurture the gifts of others. The Garden of Love had a particularly powerful impact. This single work was the keynote image for a whole genre of paintings known as the Fête Galante. Loosely translated, that means garden party, but the Fête Galante is a great deal more than that. It is a pictorial celebration of the delights of elegant, opulent, pleasure-loving men and women, eating, drinking, and making love in idyllic settings. Rubens' touch is evident in this masterpiece by a fellow Flemish painter, Antoine Watteau. Still, La Perspective is not a slavish copy of Rubens, but a carefully thought-out restatement. We can see this more clearly in a Watteau study drawing that hangs nearby. This seated lady with a fan is a preliminary sketch for the woman in the foreground of La Perspective. Watteau was deeply impressed by Rubens' treatment of the female figure. As many artists do, he started out by quite literally copying Rubens' women. Eventually, he went on to make his own changes. Thus, his women tend to be less ample than Rubens' buxom creatures, but they still bear unmistakable similarities in face and in form. Next to La Perspective is another outstanding fête galante, The Dance, by Jean-Baptiste Pater, a Flemish painter who studied under Watteau. And then there's this lush tableau by Delacroix, Turkish Women Bathing. The lineage here is clear, especially where the landscape is concerned, from Rubens' garden to Watteau's Perspective. If the garden inspired imitators in the landscape genre, so did this Rubens engraving, landscape with mired cart. There are some familiar techniques: the subtle play of light, the deft composition using tree trunks and rocks to focus attention on the human figures and the wagon. Thomas Gainsborough, the great 18th century English landscape artist, made excellent use of these devices in a genuine masterpiece, The Harvest Wagon, on loan from the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto. One of Rubens' great concerns was not surprisingly religion. For one thing, many of his commissions came from the church. For another, he reached his full powers in a period when Catholicism was just beginning to emerge from the arid days of the Counter-Reformation. Now the Restoration was dawning, and with it a renewed confidence. Rubens reflected this, and the power of his pieces proved magnetic. The engraving we see here is called Descent from the Cross. It is a variation on the central panel of a superb triptych that Rubens executed for the altar of Antwerp Cathedral. Most of this wall before us is covered with derivations of the Rubens Descent. In almost every version, his use of light and shadow, the drapery supporting the lifeless body of Christ, and the overall composition are emulated. Charles de la Fosse's version, produced in 1680, has all these elements but lacks Rubens' brilliant colors. Gainsborough's Unfinished Oil is a direct copy. And here we have a Delacroix oil based on another of Rubens' religious works, The Entombment. Delacroix's version seeks to imitate without copying. It uses vibrant colors as did the Rubens, but it places greater emphasis on the figure of Jesus. Here is an engraving showing St. Michael pitching Lucifer and the legions of the damned into hell. It is based on a larger Rubens painting known as the Little Last Judgment. Portraits, Rubens created a kind of fulsome, winsome ideal for women. Good thing he did, since his model was often his wife. Here's an oil on wood of Isabella Brandt, his first wife. Isabella died some 10 years after this portrait was completed. A few years later, Rubens took a second wife, Helen Forment, who was then 17. She also appears repeatedly in Rubens' works at least 19 times by one count. Rubens' portraits had a profound impact. Here is a sheet of superb chalk drawings by Watteau. The faces are variations on portraits from Rubens' so-called Medici cycle, which was installed in the Palais de Luxembourg. The cycle, by the way, would make a magnificent Rubens show all by itself. More than a century ago, the Goncourt brothers wrote that for a young artist there was no other cradle, no other school, no other homeland than the Palais de Luxembourg, with its paintings by Rubens on the life of Marie de Medici. The god is there, and fitting homage was paid to him. Here is another Watteau that draws on Rubens' portraits of his wives. The resemblance to Isabella Brandt is strong. The slight smile, the large and luminous eyes, the arching eyebrows. Now let's step back in time for a moment from the 19th to the 18th century to examine this portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds. For years, Reynolds, England's greatest portraitist, was hostile towards Rubens and skeptical about his talent. But in 1781, Sir Joshua toured Flanders and Holland, saw much of Rubens' work at first hand, and returned to England a convert. He never became an all-out imitator, but he was a selective borrower from Rubens, much as Gainsborough was. From Rubens, Sir Joshua learned to handle color more effectively and to position his subjects more naturally. One result is his portrait, the Countess of Harrington and her children. When Reynolds saw Rubens' descent from the cross during his visit to Antwerp, he said that none but the great colorists can venture to paint pure white linen in your flesh. But here Reynolds does so successfully, and just as successfully, he varies the flesh tones. In the collection on history and allegory, perhaps the most striking presence is that of Delacroix. Here, Delacroix has reworked one of the Medici series, Henry IV conferring the regency upon Marie de Medici. In at least one respect, Delacroix was freer than Rubens had been. The Medici were not his sponsors. As a result, he has added touches of character where Rubens could not. A suspicious and tough Marie, a flirtatious Henry. Still, the grouping looks stiff. Less so as Delacroix the apotheosis of the Duke of Buckingham, after one of Rubens' Whitehall ceiling paintings. There is yet another area of painting at which Rubens excelled. Renderings of battles and hunts, the imagery of conflict. Rubens not only captured but fevered the imagination of painters well into the 19th century. And no wonder. The canvases seethe with action. Muscles ripple on animals and men. The horses, and what horses they are, rear and paw the air, nostrils flaring and eyes rolling wildly. The art historian Jacob Burckhardt spoke glowingly of the figures which seemed to move before the spectator's eyes, the unerring fusion of color, tone, and light. It was Burckhardt who also said that Rubens' own great theme was movement. That certainly seems true in the battle of Constantine and Licinius, where the two protagonists coiled to strike one another against a backdrop of flashing spears and swords. This great oil set the style for equestrian battles down to Delacroix. So did the hippopotamus hunt. As in much of Baroque painting, this canvas incorporates everything but the proverbial kitchen sink. A ferocious hippo, a writhing crocodile, two fallen hunters, 3 yapping dogs, and as many horsemen in their mounts. Yet this tangled group works, as Géricault and Delacroix were particularly aware. These Géricault sketches of equestrian battles and horses are part of his prolonged attempt to capture, as Rubens had, the sense of movement, the interaction between horse and rider. In this area, as in most others, Rubens' influence culminated in the work of Delacroix, the passionate romantic whom Baudelaire described as a volcanic crater artistically concealed beneath bouquets of flowers. The the traveling Arabs. The capture of Weislingen. The mounted Arab attacking a panther. All indicate the depth of Delacroix's response to both Rubens and Géricault. But before we leave the exhibition, a question occurs. What about Rubens' men? If we identify his art chiefly with female imagery, where do the males fit in? The fact is that Rubens' robust ladies have virile, athletic, masculine counterparts. In this portrait of the Earl of Arundel, note the imposing, almost fierce features. This study of Christ in black chalk and white gouache is neither cadaverous nor sunken-chested, but a full-bodied, muscular figure. In other works, Rubens accentuates the sense of male strength by painting his men in darker hues, almost copper-colored, the better to set off the paler, almost lustrous flesh of his women. In any event, Rubens' males were imitated as enthusiastically as his females. See Jean Jouvenet's knotty figure in Nude Man Recumbent. In view of the range of Rubens' talent, the Providence exhibit was something to whet the appetite. But we may be seeing more before too long. 1977 happens to be the 400th anniversary of Rubens' birth, an appropriate time for a really major retrospective. That raises some questions. Why should we be interested in this man? In what way can he speak to us? After all, 1577 is a long way off, not just temporally, but spiritually as well. Rubens is not only a man of another age, but one who is so comfortable and self-assured that we can hardly imagine it in our anxiety-ridden age. His paintings, full of cupids and nymphs, satin pennants and Grecian columns, are out of tune with the modern taste for spareness and economy. And yet the paintings were executed with such genius and style that we cannot help but admire them. For another thing, Rubens was an innovator who cleared new ground for all who followed him. Finally, and possibly most important, he was a man of expansive spirit as well as extravagant talent. He was generous of himself, gentle with others, compassionate, and tolerant. That kind of spirit can speak to us, even across a gulf of 4 centuries.